Tens of thousands of demonstrators filled the streets in Myanmar to protest former civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi's trial, which began this week in secret. Protesters have been calling for the reinstatement of democracy since the military launched a coup on February 1st. And as Nick Schifrin reports, the protesters in Myanmar are also demanding a society that ignores their new military rulers.
At secret locations across Myanmar, healthcare workers who used to work for the government now say they work for the people.
This will be a great trouble for the military to control this kind of civil disobedience movement. It's the kind of protesting, not obey the orders prescribed by the military.
This doctor asked us to withhold his name for security reasons. He's on strike from a government hospital and instead treating anti-coup protesters. And he says the doctor's strike is only the beginning.
If the health systems fail and shut down, they might get a lot of problems. We start the movement and ask every ministry and other departments to join us to make a bigger, stronger society movement.
Hundreds of thousands of public servants are on strike as part of a civil disobedience movement, or CDM. They defy military limits on gatherings to launch the country's largest protests in more than 10 years. Firefighters created their own fire brigades. Engineers stopped constructing buildings. When the real police arrived to arrest the doctors, citizen police rushed into the street to protect them, and teachers refused to teach in government schools.
Teachers, lawyers, as well as doctors, they're people we learn from, people who guide us in life.
Min Thant is a Burmese journalist who was part of a Reuters team that won a Pulitzer Prize for stories critical of the Burmese military that landed 2 of its reporters in prison. She says the civil disobedience movement is targeting the states and military's foundations. Protesters heard the military might seize money from banks, so they blocked the central bank and called on bank staff to join the movement. Protests also try to prevent the junta from collecting taxes.
Things that really directly impact the any government's ability to govern and enact their policy and fund what they're doing.
What the military is doing is reversing Myanmar's fragile democracy. The February 1st coup declared a state of emergency and installed army leader Min Aung Hlaing for at least a year. Democratic leader Aung San Suu Kyi is now in house arrest and facing charges that could lead to years of imprisonment. And now the junta is beginning to use violence. In southern Myanmar, police fired rubber bullets. In the north, soldiers fired to disperse the crowd. And this week, for the first time since protests began, soldiers appeared on the streets in armored vehicles. The military spokesman claims civil servants are being manipulated.
We found out that the protesters are inciting the violence and illegally pressuring civil servants. The protesters have become violent rather than peaceful.
But we've seen this resistance and crackdown before. 1988 uprisings against the government were met with a massacre that killed thousands of protesters. But today's Myanmar is less isolated. And young people reluctant to give up democratic gains are more connected and creative. This week there were breakdancing protesters, musician protesters who played a well-known anthem of resistance, and young men who wanted to infuse the protests with some muscle. Many younger protesters want more than the coup's reversal. They want a new founding document that removes the military's power, says Thant.
There is a contingency who their main demand is the release of Aung San Suu Kyi, like a return to status quo. And then there's another contingency that says, no, that is much more on the side of a more radical change.
As night falls, protesters bang on pots and pans, a tradition to ward off evil spirits. Hundreds of miles away in Bangladesh, Muslim Rohingya refugees express solidarity. Myanmar's ethnic minorities are especially vulnerable, and no minority has suffered the military's wrath more than the Rohingya. And civilian leaders have not held the military to account. In 2017, Suu Kyi defended the military after the UN accused it of genocide.
I think one other reason that military could have a coup was because they have been enjoying the impunity for the crimes that they have committed over the several decades.
Wei Wei Nu is a Rohingya activist and former political prisoner. She calls for that radical change, a post-coup Myanmar that decentralizes authority to give ethnic minorities more autonomy.
A more inclusive democracy where we embrace our diversity and we assure rights of the people regardless of their ethnicity or a religion. One way to address is to basically draft in a new inclusive, truly federal democratic constitution.
Last week, President Biden sanctioned top Myanmar generals and froze $1 billion of their assets in the U.S. It's a 180 from the last time senior Biden officials were in charge of Myanmar policy. In 2010, the country tentatively opened. In 2011, Suu Kyi met Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. In 2012, President Obama became the first sitting U.S. president to visit, and the U.S. lifted sanctions. Today, the military is back in charge, and protesters want the Biden administration to go further and do what the people have done, go around the junta and deal only with civilian leadership. The same day Biden's sanctions were announced, healthcare workers shut down their clinic for fear the military would intimidate patients. But the doctor we spoke to says civil disobedience will continue.
Just listen, the voice of the people. Because this is the country that we own, we all need to get our voices louder than the small group of the military people.
The military, though small, holds the levers of power, but it's outnumbered by protesters who hope to reduce that leverage by creating a society that's run by the people. For the PBS Newshour, I'm Nick Schifrin.